Hello and welcome to the HiberNation. This is the video for between the new moons of January and February, and we're going to be journeying with dormouse. So I'm going to start by inviting you to take a bit of time to do some reflecting and really tuning in and dropping into our virtual hibernation space. If you were with us last month and you were working with Bear, this can be a great little moment to do a bit of reflecting and a bit of gratitude practice to Bear and anything that you learned or journeyed through last month. It can also be a really nice little moment to check in with yourself and just see where you're at and start thinking about your connection to the seasons and how it's feeling around you right now. Here in the south of England, it's really cold. It's still winter. We're only like a couple of weeks after Christmas, really, aren't we? Not quite a full month since the solstice. So we are coming out of the darkness, but it's not spring yet. It's still winter. And it's getting lighter. That's the thing that I'm noticing the most. Even though it's cold, it can still be incredibly grey. It's pretty soggy. I know some parts of the UK have had snow and I am super jealous because we've just had like a lot of rain. But then the nights are getting shorter, and I've been out a couple of times recently at sort of 4:30, walking the dog and things like that, and it hasn't been dark, it hasn't been pitch black, and that has felt different. We did a little bit of garden tidying at the weekend, and there were just beginnings of little shoots of things starting to come up. So we are not out of winter, but we are heading that way. So how are you feeling, and how wintry are you feeling? You might be picking up on the kind of new year, new you vibes. You might still be feeling very much like you want to hibernate. Either of those and anything in between is totally fine. This is very much a place of no judgment. But this is a great little moment to just pause the video. There are some pages in the ebook to help you do some reflecting, or you can just grab your journal or whatever you make notes on and just spend a little bit of time dropping into gratitude, thanking Bear, and just checking in with where you are and how you're feeling at this time of the year. So if you were with us last month, you're going to really notice a change in pace from this month to last month. And if you weren't, that's okay. I'm just going to introduce you a little bit to the flavour and feel that I've got coming through as we work with this month's animal mascot, dormouse. So the feeling that I'm getting is a very light one. Dormice are very small creatures. We're working with the hazel dormouse, and I'll go into some more facts and things a bit further on in the video. But I just wanted to kind of set the tone really from the beginning. We've talked previously in some of the other videos about the lenses through which we view animals, and today I'm mostly going to be talking in kind of two lenses. One of them is a conservation lens, a conservation perspective, which is really important for dormice, and then the other one is this kind of like my fairy lens, this slightly more magical way of connecting to nature that just happens really automatically for me with dormouse. And I wanted to just share a little story with you before we begin. Because dormouse was the founding member of the hibernation. The phrase join the hibernation first came to me when I was pregnant in 2015, and it was around September, and the first symptom that I had was just incredible tiredness. I did get morning sickness and stuff later, but it started just with this feeling of like exhaustion. And the image that popped into my mind was of the dormouse in Alice in Wonderland, and I did a little bit of searching and researching into dormice and drew a curled up dormouse with a circlet of brambles around. and wrote the phrase "join the hibernation." So that was my first autumn and winter of really letting myself hibernate, pretty much because I had no choice. And it was interesting to me to notice when I had this big physical change going on, that it took that for me to actually listen to my body at that time of year, a time of year that I'd previously found really difficult. Autumn and winter for like a lot of my life has been a difficult time for me, but that autumn and winter was different. And the reason that I started this course and kind of started talking more about the hibernation after I'd had my baby and wasn't pregnant anymore, was just this feeling that we shouldn't have to be pregnant to listen to our bodies. It shouldn't take something as big as that for us to tune into our mammal-like nature. Our mammal nature, not even like, we are mammals, we are animals, we are part of the natural world. And the seasons affect us deeply, particularly, it depends where you live, doesn't it? Like, I'm just thinking about, you know, the days can be incredibly short in some parts of the world, and proper snow and all of those things. So it isn't that long in our history that we've had electric light and the 9-to-5 working week and all of those sort of artificial things that we've decided should be the paces of life for humans. And I wanted to create something that really was an escape from that, as much as it can be, because obviously we are human and we are part of the human world, and the human world has these structures that kind of remove us from nature a lot of the time, but that's an illusion. we are still part of nature. So that's where it all started, and I feel really excited to have come to dormouse in our journey, because they're the creature that started it all, and they are totally magical, and there's this beautiful light-footedness to them that we're going to be learning a bit more about in the rest of the video. But they are an arboreal species, so they're practically flying amongst the treetops. They very rarely come to the earth, so it's an airy feel to this creature. They do hibernate on the ground or underground, so that's when they come down to earth for winter. But the rest of their lives, a lot of it is up in the air. And when you learn about some of the things that they eat, it's like a fairy menu. So welcome to this lighter, more fairy-ish vibe this month. I hope you enjoy it. We're going to move on to some dormouse facts, and then on to the more metaphysical side of dormouse, then the guided meditation, and a bit of intention setting at the end. So let's start with some dormouse facts. So there are around 30 species of dormice in the world. We've got 2 in the UK. One of them is a very small population of introduced edible dormice, but we're going to be focusing on the hazel dormouse, which is our more common UK species. It's still not that common, but it's been here longer, and it used to be quite widespread, but it's now found almost like, if you imagine a map of the United Kingdom, it's kind of like not found north of the Watford Gap. They don't really like cold or wet weather, so they are more predominantly found in the south of the UK and Wales. And whereas last month we were working with a creature that had become extinct in the UK, this month we're working again with a creature who hasn't quite met that fate. They're clinging on with their tiny paws, and there are a lot of people working really hard to ensure that dormice stay here in the UK. Globally, they're not doing too badly in a conservation way. They're not seen as under threat in a global perspective, but within the UK they are. And they're an amazing little mouse. I can't wait to share some really cool facts with you. So they're a small ginger and white mouse. They've got a kind of really beautiful ginger body with a white belly. They have a fluffy tail, which is one of the ways to identify them from other mice. Generally, mice have a kind of pink skin colour tail, but they have a fluffy tail. And that's one of their ways of defending themselves. It's thought that it's a bit like a lizard that can drop its tail. If something catches it by the tail, they'll pull off some fluff and hopefully the dormouse will be able to get away. As I mentioned before, they are an arboreal species, which means they live mostly in the trees when they're not hibernating. And habitat-wise, it means that they need ladders, basically, a kind of habitat network of ladders. So some tall trees, but they also really love coppiced hazel and shrubs and hedgerows. So they've got this kind of like ability to move within their habitat three-dimensionally. And that's one of the reasons why they are at risk, is there's not that much of that habitat around. It requires sensitive woodland management. But I just love this idea of this kind of three-dimensional space that they're moving around, and the plants that they need include bramble, honeysuckle, hazel, and taller trees like oak, ash. So one of the cool things about dormice from a conservation perspective is they're what's known as a flagship species. So because they are a little bit fussy, it's one way to put it, a little bit picky about their habitat and quite sensitive to things like biodiversity loss and habitat fragmentation, things where landscapes get cut up by roads or developments, or changes in farming practices mean that maybe more pesticides are being used or herbicides, and that's affecting the biodiversity in an area. They're a bit of a canary in the coal mine for that. They really are very sensitive. So if you have them on a site, it's a sign that that site's probably going to have a lot of other creatures as well. And they are known as like a bio-indicator. It's a good sign if they are on a site that that area has a lot of biodiversity. Because they're basically a bit like a little head witch. They need, I mean, like all creatures, they need food throughout the year, but they will switch what they eat depending on what's available. So they'll move from eating flowers to eating berries to eating nuts to eating insects. They just need to have that constant flow of something being available for them. And so if you've got them in an area, it's a good sign that that habitat is going to be supporting other creatures as well, like pollinating insects and birds and other mammals. So that's something that's really cool about them. They are incredibly hard to spot. Some people who do surveys put out boxes for them to sleep in during the day. They won't hibernate in a nesting box, but that's one way that you can find them. But because they are small, and because if they are in an area, they're not a very densely populated creature. You won't get loads of them, even if they're doing quite well. They don't live close together. They're not like badgers or some of the other creatures that we've been working with where there's kind of clans of them. They have babies and mate, and so they will obviously meet other dormice, but they're quite solitary and you don't get a lot of them in one area, so they are quite hard to spot. And of course they're arboreal, so they're up in the trees a lot of the time, and they're very small, so there's this elusive kind of quality to them. Like hedgehog and bear, dormice are proper hibernators, so they will pile on the body weight just before they go into hibernation in October and November. I think they weigh around 15 to 20 grams. They will pretty much double in size before they go into hibernation. They'll put on so much weight, mostly from eating hazelnuts. And one of the things I love about them is you can tell if they've been around by looking at hazelnuts. And they drill like a little hole, almost like a can opener, with their teeth to like take off the lid of the hazelnut. And some other creatures do that too, but with hazel dormice, you won't see teeth marks particularly. It'll be a very smooth cut. So that's another way of knowing if they are around. And so they pile on the pounds and then they will sleep and go into torpor in a hibernation state underground or on the ground. They need somewhere that's going to remain a pretty constant cool temperature, so they'll drop their own body temperature down and all of their body processes slow down. And they also like places that are a little bit damp, which is interesting because they don't drink or eat whilst they're hibernating. But if they can breathe in damper air, that will keep them hydrated, which is really clever, isn't it? I think it's really interesting noticing how well adapted these little creatures are, because they've got another really cool adaptation in relation to sleep, which is one of the reasons that they have this very sleepy reputation. And that's even when it's spring and summer, they've come out of hibernation, they can go back into torpor for short periods. So if the weather's particularly wet, their beautiful ginger fur isn't very waterproof. So if the weather's wet, it's not good for foraging, they can go back into that torpor state. So they might spend as much as 75% of their lives asleep, which is why they have this amazing reputation and where their name comes from. Dormir is, I mean, you can probably hear it, can't you? There's, I think it's French, Spanish, like a lot of Latin words have dormir as a sleep word. They are also known locally in different parts of the UK as dozy mice. And there's a few other names as well in the ebook where you can see that they've got this really cute sleepy reputation, and it's for a reason. But when they are awake, they are not dozy. I think that's the thing that maybe their reputation they don't quite deserve. These are arboreal little mice that can move three-dimensionally through the trees. They are agile like squirrels. They've got specially adapted feet that can turn so they can move in 3 dimensions. It's not all sleep. When they're awake and they are fast and agile. And I just think that's really cool, and that's where that kind of more fairyish quality comes in for me. They're also nocturnal, so that's another reason why we're not going to really see them very much. So they're little starlit fairies bouncing through the branches and eating blackberries, which is just such a beautiful image. So dormice have litters of about 4 babies in the summer months. They might stay with their mother for a little while, but like I said, they're pretty solitary, so once they're independent they will go off and live their own little dormouse lives. So these little creatures also have another really cool adaptation, and they're incredibly whiskery. So they've got 35 whiskers on each side of their face, and they can move them up to 5 times a second. And they've been observed kind of pulsing them and moving them completely on different axes so that they can, I guess they can measure distances and sense what's around them. And if you look at photographs and video of them, it's almost like they've got a spider's web on the front of their face. They've got this incredibly sensitive network of whiskers tuned into little muscles in their face that they can move, and they can pick up what's around them through. So they've got big eyes, like a lot of nocturnal mammals do, and then this network of sensory whiskers to help them navigate and move through the trees at night. Now, I couldn't find any stock footage that I could put into this video of dormice. They're really hard to film, apparently, so I've done a little YouTube playlist for you. So if you want to go and watch that and just soak up some juicy dormouse vibes, I'm going to do a little space to pause the video, and you can go and watch some of these really beautiful little mammals doing these amazing behaviours and climbing through the trees. And then we'll come back and we'll move on to the more metaphysical aspects of dormouse. we're going to start tuning in now to the more metaphysical essence of dormouse and what we can learn from them as we slowly but surely make our way into spring. I've got my fairy wings on for this part because this is where the kind of more fairy vibes really start to come in for me. And it starts with the dormouse's diet, which just reads like a hedge witch's cookbook or a fairy menu. There are so many species in there that are so iconic within British folklore and kind of the Gaelic traditions and Celtic traditions. So we've got a creature that eats oak flowers, honeysuckle flowers. It will eat the flowers and the blackberries on bramble plants, sycamore seeds, ash, wayfaring tree, yew berries, birch seeds, blackthorn. I think the blackthorn flowers are a little bit too early for it, but it will eat sloes, which are the very bitter, big purple berries that grow on blackthorn trees. And they will eat hawthorn flowers and berries as well. And they'll also move to a more carnivorous diet. They also eat aphids, caterpillars, and gall wasps. And they can't digest leaves, which is really interesting. So they're sort of a herbivore, but that doesn't eat leaves. They don't have the bit of their stomach that would allow them to do that. So instead we've got this kind of incredible fairy menu and this very seasonally shifting diet that requires, like we've mentioned before, that need for there to be a lot of diversity in their habitat so that they can have this diversity in their diet. And I just think there's something really beautiful about that. They're ingredients in potions, aren't they? Maybe that's why it just sounds so magical. And particularly after this solid heaviness of working with bear last month, this week we're working with this much more elusive, light-footed, air-moving little creature that is out at night under the stars, scampering through the trees. Now there's this interesting thing as well. I've been reading a little bit about our history with dormice, and one part of it is this idea that they are elusive and they are hidden, but they're really iconic. They're a creature that a lot of people know about, even though many of us have never seen them. Even people who are, spotters of everything might only have seen a dormouse once if they're lucky. And I was reading some interesting stories about when we were more involved in woodlands and people were more out coppicing and working with trees in their day-to-day lives. They would have been coming across dormice more. And sometimes woodworkers would take dormice home to show their children. And one thing that can happen that's really kind of sweet and unfortunate is that during the day they might be nesting in a tree, and if the wind gets too blowy they can be blown out, and you might find a dormouse on a path still in torpor, still asleep, possibly snoring, that you could just kind of move back to the side and at some point it will wake itself up and sort itself out. So they have been spotted, and they've possibly been spotted mostly when they're asleep and not even woken up throughout the whole thing, but are obviously not dead. Like, if you notice some of the videos of dormice, they snore really loudly. So they were this is maybe where this kind of iconic sleepy mouse story comes from, is that if you did come across them, they were probably asleep and didn't wake up, which I just think is really adorable. And then of course they were included as a character in Alice in Wonderland, and became, extra iconic. It's only a minor character. They're one of the character animals at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, and they spend a lot of the time falling asleep. But of course that's been made into films by Disney, and there's a Tim Burton version, and they sort of entered into this sort of more iconic status as a result of that. And I think that's also why that fairy vibe is there for me. There's that kind of weirdly surreal, magical Alice in Wonderland connection with tea parties. And so of course I like them. Of course I feel connected to them. And the other thing that is really beautiful and interesting about them is how they are connected to our relationship with the forests, and particularly with hazel. So I don't know if you've ever been near a hazel tree. They're one of my favourites. They have these kind of beautiful, quite fat, heart-shaped leaves that are really velvety, and they obviously have hazelnuts that grow on them, and they really respond well to being coppiced. So you can chop them off at the bottom, and within the year these very often very thick, quite straight, shiny brown grey poles will grow back, and then they can also grow into quite large trees. But we would have been actively coppicing hazel for charcoal, for wattle and daub. It's the main structural ingredient if you think of like a wattle and daub wall, which is almost like a basket you sort of plaster clay-like stuff onto to build houses, you know, kind of in the from the Neolithic times. That was done with hazel. And so for a long time humans were working with woods, and not just in ways that were completely destructive, which is sometimes a surprise, hey? We had a relationship with sensitively managing trees for our own purposes, and those purposes really benefited dormice too. And as we've stopped doing that, as we found other sources of fuel and other structural materials, we stopped managing the woods in that way. And so the dormice lost out, because they don't do well in just a kind of low foresty, you know, kind of like ferns and then big tall trees, like a lot of forests can become. A lot of woodland is like that, isn't it? I'm just thinking about one of my favourite woods where we see bluebells. It's bluebells and it's beech trees, and that's pretty much it. There might be the occasional holly bush in between, but it's very much 2 layers. We know dormice need ladders, but a lot of woodland habitat doesn't have that anymore. So there's this interesting thing, and this happens a lot in conservation, as we change the ways that we interact with our environments. We change those environments, often not for the better, for the wildlife that lives there. And that's where habitat fragmentation then can become tricky, because if that area is kind of degraded and there's nowhere connected for the animals to move to, then that area just kind of collapses. So there's just this interesting piece around humans and our relationship with nature, particularly with trees and dormice, and how it impacts on them, and obviously loads of other species too. And of course, the main metaphysical aspect of a dormouse is this sleepy aspect. The idea is spending 3/4 of your life asleep. I don't know what the stats are for how much humans sleep, but I know it's not as much as that. And I know that we don't have this ability to just go, right, pause, that's it, I'm done. Oh, the weather's terrible today, I'm just going to go into hibernation. That's so powerful and so magical, isn't it? And to have become a kind of icon for sleepiness and an icon for hibernation is something really beautiful and interesting about that. And as I mentioned in the facts bit as well, their name is connected to that, and they've had lots of other names like Dozy Mouse, which I just think is like the sweetest name, isn't it, for a dormouse? And so a big part of their essence is connected to rest, to pausing, to being very in tune with what's going on around you, and if it's beneficial to you, if you're going to be able to get what you need, or if you need to press pause.
There's a person and 2 people walking left.
So as we move on to intention setting, this becomes quite an interesting one around our fight or flight or freeze responses, because it's a very impressive freeze response, isn't it? If you literally fall asleep when things aren't optimal for you. But if you start thinking about that in terms of how could you be a little bit more or a little bit less dormouse, this could be one where you start thinking about your freeze response or your ability to pause, because it can go either way, can't it? Sometimes we can just freeze too much, or sometimes it's impossible to feel like you can stop. That was a big problem for me, particularly last year. Giving myself permission to stop is a big challenge, and that's one of the reasons why I invented this whole program. So as we move into starting to think about intention setting and what we can learn from Dormouse, that feels like a really powerful one. And especially as we start moving into slowly creeping in towards spring and thinking about coming out of hibernation and coming out of sleepiness. What do we need to help us wake up? So we're going to move into the guided meditation now to help you tune into Dormouse and answer some of these questions. And then we'll move into a bit of intention setting after that. I hope you enjoyed the guided meditation and that it helped you connect into Dormouse. Don't forget that you can come back to any of the meditations from the hibernation at any point, anytime you want a bit of magic from that particular animal. You can always go back and listen again. It doesn't have to just be tied into setting intentions. But I'm just going to mention again some of the themes and ideas from Dormouse that you might want to pick up on. So there's this idea of this magical head witch diet. There's this kind of light-footed fairy feel. There's this idea around being hidden and elusive, but still iconic, which is a kind of interesting idea. There's of course the sleepiness and the pausing and the ability to stop. There's the relationship between the trees and the mice and us, and this idea of managing and nurturing tree life feels really beautiful and powerful to me. And there's also, I forgot to mention in the other bit, but they don't move very far from their nest. They are generally moving in a range of around 70 meters from their nests. So there's this kind of homebody sort of a feel there as well. And if you have a look through the pack and listen to the meditation, just find something that resonates for you. Dormouse might have a completely different message that's not related to anything that I've talked about. It's important for me to feel that you're getting what you need out of this. It doesn't have to be anything that I've said. You're going to find your own things and your own qualities of these creatures. And that's why you can go back to the meditations whenever you feel called to just get a little bit extra magic from them. And then the invitation, as ever, is for some time over the next few days, basically any time up until the full moon ideally, to spend a bit of time setting an intention, creating a little ritual for yourself, creating that moment to pause and think about what you are calling in or letting go this month. As I was talking about at the beginning of the video, that this can be an interesting time of year because it is a new calendar year. You might have that really lovely, oh, I've turned over a new page, it's a new beginning feeling. You might have a bit of that and a bit of the kind of leftover winter apathy vibes still. It's about you and your pace and what feels good to you. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, when that new year thing kicks in, that we have to kind of get a bit austere, that you can't have nice things anymore. You have to put the Christmas decorations down, you have to stop eating, you have to do loads of exercise, you have to basically become a new person. And just remember it's still winter, and the things that felt good in the middle around Christmas, like fairy lights and mulled wine and cozy blankets and cups of hot chocolate are still allowed if they feel good now. You don't, if you feel like you want to give some stuff up or make a change, that's totally cool. But if you don't, I don't want you to feel that pressure that can be really prevalent at this time of year, that you have to give things up. I feel like it's much more important to really listen to our own hearts and our own intuition as opposed to the pressure in relation to the calendar year. This program is about the natural year and natural cycles. And so that's what the invitation really is, particularly this month. What do you need? What's going to help you? And find a way of phrasing that, as we've talked about before. Intentions, it's like a kind of a subconscious trick if you can phrase your intention as if it's already with you. So I am, I release, I have, I do this, rather than I will. Because our minds are really tricksy and clever, and if it has that kind of future tense in it, we will have a tendency to think it's never going to come, because it's always going to be, oh, I will. Oh, I'll do that tomorrow. She said famously. I say that quite a lot. Whereas if you say, I am doing that, then immediately your subconscious, and therefore the universe, which picks up on these things, starts to move it closer to you, because it's already with you. So just remembering that as you weave the words of your intention through into a little ritual. Remembering that there's no pressure. It can be as simple as just saying it in your mind. You can use the Moonifest app that we've mentioned before. You can write it down, you can burn it, you can do whatever feels good. I think there's an extra invitation this month with Dormouse in mind to do what feels good for you and is going to nourish you at this time of year, because the light is coming back. It's still winter, so there's this kind of slight push and pull feeling, and the invitation is for you to find what feels good for you to move through that.